Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Art of Play. Before today's episode begins, I want to give a quick warning. This episode is a simulation of hosting a Session Zero, like in D&D and Pathfinder, and includes some discussion in the second half about lines and veils, the things we aren't okay with in a game. While this discussion isn't really in-depth, I still want to give a trigger warning that we're going to mention the topics of sexual assault, breaking reality, body horror, and racism. If you're okay with us bringing up these topics, I'll give another warning about halfway through the episode again, so you know when it's coming. Anyways, enjoy the episode. We are students of the Art of Play.
And we do this show called The Art of Play.
A show for the players who ask, why?
I'm Vi.
And I'm Gaia.
Hey Gaia, what are we talking about today?
So today, we're going to be building off of our last recorded episode. So last week, we did a lot of discussion on Session Zeros. How do you run them? What should be included? What should not be included? Why they matter overall. And we thought that it'd be a really useful tool for people who are listening to be able to see a Session Zero in action, or at least a little bit of one. So we've brought back our favorite guest from last week, Mark.
Hey, how's it going?
And we're going to be doing a Session Zero together, where I'm going to be representing the DM position, and Mark and Vi here with me are going to be representing the players in today's session. So, to kind of give an overview of the episode, I always like to give my summaries at the beginning. We're going to be doing three main ideas for the Session Zero, so you get a little bit of all of them. We're going to go through the general game theme. We're going to go through the game rules, or at least a couple of rules, for example, so you know what things should be talked about in a game. And then we're going to end off the episode after a break on a discussion of lines and veils, what lines you can't cross in a game, what things you not want to see, etc. So,
Cool.
Any comments from anyone before we begin?
No.
Sounds awesome.
Yeah, sounds like a good episode.
Okay, cool. So we're going to take the position of you've all just walked into a room, sat down, we're getting ready to start a game, and I'm here like, hello, I am your DM for this game. My name is Gaia, for those of you who have not met me, I guess. Give myself a DM name.
Two players walk into a bar. You see a GM alone in the corner.
Right? Like, I'm just like, my name is Iluve, which is a name that I use in fantasy a lot, which means Robin, which is my middle name. So, the first thing that we're going to have to do to figure out a game is figure out what kind of players we have at the table. We need to make sure that the game that we're playing contributes to everyone's enjoyment. So I'm going to ask both of you a few questions to get an idea of what type of game would be best for me to DM and for you to play together. So the first question I want to ask both of you to kind of get this game down is, what types of shows and games have you both liked recently that you might like to see maybe in a game, or that you just really enjoyed? And I think, Vi, you might have one. So I'm going to pass over to you first.
Excellent. We're playing this in a world where you haven't built anything yet.
Yeah, assume like I've played a lot of games, so I have a lot of material to pull from, but I haven't set anything in stone yet.
Okay, perfect. And we're pretending that we're playing like D&D.
Like,
right, we haven't chosen a game system?
Fantasy system,
Okay,
but
perfect.
not
A general fantasy system.
Oh,
Yeah,
excellent.
I haven't
There may
picked
be
one.
5 editions.
Perhaps.
So I have the freedom to pick from like Pathfinder or
Gotcha.
D&D, or even some of the other ones like Blades in the Dark.
Dungeon World.
Yeah. Dungeon World. So what's some media that you've really enjoyed lately?
I really liked House of the Dragon recently. That was a really, really good show. I hadn't ever seen Game of Thrones, so I walked in and I was like, well, fantasy setting, supposed to be really well done, has dragons. I'm sold. And then I really, really enjoyed it. So that's one for me.
That's one I haven't seen. I'm going to choose a non-fantasy example, which still is relevant to me. I finally caught up on Star Trek Discovery. And the most recent season was all about this season-long arc of discovering who the bad guys were and having competing forces trying to figure it all out with competing philosophies. I thought it was really fascinating.
Okay. Yeah, I also really like Star Trek Discovery.
So
It's a good one.
I'm going to hitch on one of our discussions before the episode for media that I've seen that I would like to incorporate. I think everyone has realized this at some point, but I'm a really big fan of Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
I'm a huge fan. I have read through all of the books, including The Hobbit and The Silmarillion, and I have tried multiple times to get through the Unfinished Tales, which is a very hard read.
I don't think they're supposed to be... You can't finish reading them
You have
unfinished.
finished them, yeah.
Well, finish reading the published version, let's say it like that, from Christopher Tolkien. I'm a huge fan of Lord of the Rings. And in D&D, I love taking kind of those massive epic fantasy world-building elements into my games, right? So I, as a DM, would really enjoy bringing that into our games.
Cool.
It kind of sounds like if we put all these three things together, we're looking at a world that is like pretty politics heavy, pretty like depth of world lore is pretty significant. and we're looking at sort of like big time events, right? Like
Right.
kind of world ending sort of things.
Yeah.
Although in the case of Star Trek Discovery, it's not quite so much.
Well,
but
this last season was universe
Okay,
ending, so
cool.
it kind of fits. But to me, there's also an element here of there's a big story going on. Like there may be little stories along the way,
But there's a big thing.
big thing that's happening, which doesn't happen in all role-playing games. A lot of them are episodic, where something happens this week,
Yeah.
something brand new happens next week, which has no relationship with the previous one. I like the idea of that
Yeah.
continuing story.
This
that
feels
builds.
like a big full arc and maybe some kind of like regime change based
Possibly,
on these three
yeah.
examples.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely like the mega adventure kind of, or grand adventure
Yeah,
concept.
with the PCs kind of near the center of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I can pull from it as well, it seems everyone likes a degree of like high communication within it as well, right? Because all of these are politics themed, but there's a lot of negotiation, diplomacy, talking
Yeah.
between crew members,
And philosophy as
and
well.
philosophy.
Yeah, that's fair.
So a game that's a grand adventure mixed in with like a lot of diplomacy, politics, talking,
Yeah.
right? It's not just fight thing. It's genuinely try to address systemic problems or society problems.
My initial thought here, but now after you say that, it might not be relevant, is to do something a little bit like sort of rebellion based, where there's like maybe trying to do like a coup or something could be kind of fun.
Yeah, I've run games like that before, and I've really enjoyed them.
And there's also a question of it's not a simple, straightforward answer of what the actual
Yeah.
solution is. It has to be kind of figured out.
Yeah, I like the idea of there not being like a hard, like black and white line here. That it's like we played morally gray, and any way we swing this, the characters could be heroes or villains.
That said, there are definite villains
Yes.
in most of these stories as
Yeah.
well, who are really just philosophically opposed to the players, not evil.
Yeah, this is the fun thing of like of the villain. You could totally flip your idea of who's a bad guy in the story if you do the actually you see this from their perspective, and you swing your whole viewpoint the other way.
And you get that opportunity for people that your character knows and may even trust up to a certain point to take the opposite stance,
Yeah.
which is the Star Trek Discovery did exactly that too.
Yeah, I'm hearing also that people do like the idea of some, maybe not grand villain, but grand opponent. Even if in the weeds there's gray areas, there's still a clear picture for the party, at least a goal, but maybe they do have to think, is this the right goal? But there is
Yeah.
a goal that feels morally right to aim for.
We're getting into that like nebulous abstract bit of like we'd have to put in some hard pieces to actually talk about this better.
Yeah,
But
it's like a trolley problem. Something.
Well,
Yeah.
it involves
Yeah.
choices, right? Not necessarily easy choices.
yeah,
And
I
I think
think
those are fun to play.
it would be a really good game for this example to have a place where you make hard choices, right? Where you make hard choices that have like time constraints. You don't get to waffle on it. It's like, do we step in and keep this guy from being executed because that's happening now, or do we let him die?
Well, that's a good question for the game. Would you two like that in our hypothetical game? Would you like having these hard timed choices?
I think it would be entertaining.
I think it'd be fun.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to do it every session. I would want to have a
you
little
want
relief.
to build up to it.
Yeah.
I think too. I'd also want to have moments where where choices can be rewarded with good moments too. Like
Yeah.
it's one thing where you can have like a grimdark setting where all your choices are bad, so you're forced to make choices, but they're
Yeah.
all bad. I wouldn't want to necessarily go that route. Sometimes that's fine.
We don't need to always choose like the lesser of two evils.
Right. We don't want
Yeah.
always trolley problems
It
where
would-
it's like somebody's going to die.
It
and
would
you're
be
gonna
really nice if
responsible.
sometimes you get to make the good choice that is the clear choice,
Mm.
right? Where, okay, you are going to step in and save this person, and that person is innocent, and
Right.
nothing you've seen has led them the other way. Like
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
So now I'm going to ask you two a second question. I have 3 total questions to really get this down to what type of game you would like to play. I know in a real session I might ask more, but these 3 are my most important ones. So the next question is, what types of games you've played in the past, not strictly D&D, but at least related, have you enjoyed or not enjoyed? If you can bring like 2 examples, one you like, one you dislike, that's perfect, but anything to help guide me of your past experiences that you want to either emulate or avoid.
I'm on the second campaign with one GM, and the first campaign was really, really good. It was fun. And part of it was that all the players are kind of accepting of role-playing. Nobody was really standoffish. People engaged with it. And that was one of the nice things. Plus, the NPCs that we had surrounding us would also engage in that role-playing. It also had a bit of an epic nature to it. And we really got to see how we were saving the universe. It was a really kind of fun moment, and that perspective was there. There was also elements of kind of being able to step back from the scene and describe the surrounding and describe the context in which we were gaming, which led to that epic flavor.
Yeah, the one game I keep calling back to, I think it like really imprinted on me the first time we played it, was Wanderhome. And I think part of it was that it has some of that like shared collaborative narration. So I would start like describing a scene, right? And I'd be like, okay, we're in this valley, and maybe the valley's like shield shaped, and you know, in that game there's kind of lore about like there was a war, there is no longer a war. And I was like, okay, so maybe they're using like, you know, this was like a field of battle, and now they're using all of the like armor and stuff that they're digging up and all of the spears, and they're making them into like fence posts. So like all of the town's shingles were once like shields and armor and stuff, and we're gonna call it like the shielded valley. And then players like chiming in to be like, oh yeah, and what if this, and what if that other thing, and that like shared kind of narration and buy-in was really, really strong.
Yeah, if I can talk about some of my favorite games as well, I'll give an example of one of my favorite moments from my games. I DM'd a game about a year ago now where I put all my players in like this big arena, and it was a big story reason why they're in there that had 5 major sections, and it took 3 sessions to get through this arena. And it kind of played like a continuous combat. There was no jump in of combat, jump out of combat. They were always in an initiative state. Just sometimes I said, okay, we can break the turns and let you do things until a new enemy appears where we'll go back into the turns. And I really liked that because it was this continuous role play. Even within the combat, they had to please the crowd, and they had to take actions to make sure the crowd was happy, and the crowd could give them gifts, Hunger Games style. That's something I loved in one of my previous games, and it was incorporating role play into combat that I really enjoyed.
I kind of want to take the other side. We were talking about which ones you didn't like. And I was in a game where essentially it's the classic trope of murder hobos. The only thing they were interested was, what's my stats? How quickly can I damage the creature? How much money does it have that I find on it? And there was like just encounter after encounter, combat after combat with no real context. And whenever I tried to engage in role-playing, they're like, yeah, that's nice, but how do we get to the next encounter?
Yeah. One of the games that I have enjoyed less than other games was one that was really well written, really strong narratively. But part of the way that world kind of works was that you had your character's own like individual life that was going on because it took place in one city. So the party ended up like, we would have sessions where none of us were doing the same thing. Right? So I'd be like, I'm going back to my lab because I have to go to work, because that's how because it's a very like resource heavy game, right? It's like you're counting your bullets and stuff like that. So I'd be like, I gotta go see some like psycho cyborg characters to do therapy, I guess. And I'm going to go do that for half an hour. So we had moments where we weren't playing as a team. And I think those weren't very strong sessions because like I'm there to have fun with my friends and to do some role play stuff. And instead I'm sitting there telling my DM that I'm going to do a bunch of stuff and doing it, and maybe hopefully we'll get back to the action next session. And
it's the plight of a wizard in a lot of D&D campaigns where you're trying to transcribe spells, which take hours and hours and hours. You're like, when am I going to do this? Well, everybody else is asleep. I'm not sleeping at all. But that doesn't work very well. And it feels like you're taking out of it, even though that's part of the game. How do you merge that back in?
Yeah, it's part of the, like, a wizard is supposed to do this thing, but that actually makes the game just a little bit worse.
Yeah.
So that leads to a good question from me. Would you two be interested in every now and then maybe having one-on-one kind of downtime sessions where it's just your player and the DM for some period of time rather than mixing that into the main game?
Go ahead.
It could be cool if we're doing something as a politics game to start games with correspondence. There's an element to, if I bring a letter to the DM and I say, I've written this thing and I'm going to write this person that I know to see if I can, exert some influence on them. That could be a good way to start the game or to do as like a pre-game thing. But I don't want to spend a session just sitting talking to one person.
I think there are some things that can be handled that way. If you're doing, in one of the games I'm playing an engineer. He builds stuff. And we had a session where all 3 of the characters were kind of doing downtime and building a week before we did this thing. But my character was one of the few that had a lot of intricate little things to do, and that could have been handled outside of the session potentially. But I also kind of came to this realization a few years ago that secrets are supposed to be told. Everybody, all the players need to know all the secrets, because then they can provide reactions that are, to the characters, unconscious, feeding into that secret element. And I don't really like secrets being taken away from the table.
Yeah, I love an open secret.
Yeah, so I think some of that downtime stuff really feeds into that. Plus, it can be, you can involve the other players when you have that. It's like, well, why don't you bring this person along and maybe have a little miniature scene that represents that.
Well, I've had some really good experiences with one of the characters was not, one of the players was having a hard time like engaging with roleplay at the table, and I was like, why don't you and we'll just go out to lunch and we'll just talk about this game and we'll just talk about like what you think about gaming generally. And turns out that they, this is the only game of D&D they've ever played, and I was like, oh great, well, why don't you go listen to this and do this. And then we talked about arguments in particular, and I learned that their character had this big secret that they were a werewolf. And I was like, okay, well, we can set up like a little thing to like reveal that in game so we have more to play with it. And we ended up doing it and having like a pretty fun session of like that character didn't want to be seen as a werewolf, so was casting like teleport spells. And then the rest of our characters like chasing them around and then finally catching them in their werewolf form and being like, what is going on? Right.
Yeah, so, similarly, in one of my games that I'm playing, one of the characters is a shapeshifter.
Yeah.
And we didn't know, but we kind of cottoned on, but it was also kind of like, that character's walking away and a different person is coming back and the player is playing that different person.
Yeah.
But it would have been more fun to kind of have that as a knowledge that we can then interpret, or we can embiggen our reactions, if you will.
Yeah.
But the other part you mentioned, though, the conversations away from the table, we usually think of those, I think we talked about those in terms of problems, but they can also be in terms of kind of coaching.
Oh, yeah.
One-on-one coaching. I think that's very appropriate.
Yeah. We also, I guess there's a good example too that one of my friends, we were going to do this heist episode because my character's like a thief and like had a whole like ring of thieves in one of the cities and stuff. And I was like, okay, well, what if we did, a big heist? And wouldn't that be fun to have in the game? And my DM was all for it. So I was like, okay, cool. Maybe this is the target and I'll just give you like some broad ideas that I have. And then you can do specific stuff so we can still like play the heist properly. And then one of my friends was like, man, I'd really love to play a character who's like more like useful in a heist than my current character. And I was like, okay, like why don't you be my like very best childhood friend, and you can just play that for the heist. And we ended up spending like 2 days straight almost talking about this other character and backstory and stuff and why they had a falling out and all of this really, really good stuff. And they ended up keeping that character because they had done so much work to be invested in it. And so now like Lena and Cass are like these two like people who are like kind of standoffish, but they're traveling together. So we have a lot of like it gets to the point where we'll be sitting across the table from each other and we'll talk to each other in character and then both realize how much like discomfort there is in a fun way. And I'm like, oh man, there's a lot of stuff that we could like dig into here if our characters like opened up a little bit more. And that's totally fun. I would love to play that in a game.
Okay, cool. So I have one more question for the both of you now. And this is kind of the penultimate, probably the most hard question for you to answer. What type of experience are you looking to have? Maybe something that you haven't done before that you want to do, or something that you're just really feeling now. Admittedly, this is actually the least important of the three questions, but it helps guide my final bit of decision making.
I think this might be what kind of character do you think you would like to play at the moment?
Yeah, and what kind of challenges do you want to take on too? Like both as a player and as a character too, right?
I mean, a valid answer is you want a game heavy in puzzles, or you want a game heavy in combat, or you want a game specifically built around the ocean. Like just a couple of notes that you really want to have in your experience.
Really curious about playing like an intrigue mystery game with a high charisma character. I think that's something I haven't done before, but I think all my current character choices are kind of leading me in that direction. That would be really fun.
Yeah, I like playing investigator type characters. I like having a high int character because then you can kind of have the excuse of solving some things. I like discovery. I like when there's sort of an unknown that's going on, and it's not a simple turn over the rock and find the answer.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of little clues that can lead in different directions.
I love staring at my notes and going back one page and being like, wait, I've figured it out. Yeah.
Or those in-character discussions where you're kind of ranging over all these different theories, and people are bringing in, the best part is when people can bring in theories that reflect their character's culture and heritage and point of view. That's always fun to me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me give a summary of the game, of the idea for the game, and see what you two think after having gone through all of this. So a game that is kind of like a high adventure kind of game. We'll put it in like a pseudo fantasy world. We didn't really pick a world in this discussion, but 2 fantasy worlds and 1 sci-fi world. Yeah, we'll pick a normal high fantasy world for this. It's going to be themed around a mystery, but this is not going to be one of those like small murder mysteries. It could be like a murder of a king style mystery, something large that's going to bring you to multiple locations on a very long adventure, particularly dealing with the high and low classes of society, dealing with politics and philosophical questions, and sometimes moral questions in our games, with lots of diplomacy, lots of role playing, lots of figuring things out, maybe puzzles, and maybe not a lot of combat. No one here discussed really enjoying combat, so we'll keep the combat low for this and make a real role-play heavy game. So
That's a really, really good point. I hadn't kind of clued into the fact that we hadn't discussed combat.
No one said combat. So to kind of guide your character building for this game, you can build a character that doesn't need a lot of combat abilities, but you might want a lot of roleplay abilities. Bards are going to be useful for this, and you're not going to get as much from paladins. But this means that you have a lot of freedom for building a big backstory for your character as well. Because if we're doing a roleplay heavy game, that makes it easier for me, right? Now, just listening to what y'all didn't want, we'll do a game that avoids murder hobos or behavior that encourages a lot of thoughtless fighting. Every fight has to have meaning.
It's
and has to have a way out without
where,
combat.
like, if you're fighting, it's because you're in a duel and, like, somebody's been offended.
Yeah.
Or there's an absolute reason that this has to be, this comes to this, you know, finally comes to this.
Yeah, the fight is unavoidable.
It comes to the Hamlet scene where he's behind the curtain. Like, it finally comes to a...
Oh, poor Polonius.
Yeah, so every fight has context. And I heard this from your discussion. Every fight has to have context, right? I also heard, like, we should avoid discussions where the party splits. We can discuss it, but let's not role play individual one by one very often. Neither of you really like the idea of one-on-one sessions too much either, so it can be the type of thing of bring this to the next session. It will open our discussion, get everybody back in the headspace, but we're back to the party when the game starts.
Yeah.
Right? I heard that you both liked that.
I do like I know I said it, but I like the idea of doing correspondence. I think that's kind of a fun way to do some of that, like, other influence and other one-on-one stuff.
To bring in a different perspective on that, this is the one that I end up with. I'm a busy guy. So if there's a requirement or an expectation of game between game, I might not be able to keep that up.
Good point.
So it's another one of those factors to consider when you're doing your session 0 is how much commitment can people reasonably have to something like that? And do they feel like they're left out if they can't participate in that?
Right.
Yeah. So that kind of gives a summary for our game. That gives me an idea of what I need to go build, and it gives you both an idea of what type of characters that you should prepare for the game. And if we need to do one-on-one style sessions, it'd be easier to do it before the start of the game rather than in their own unique session, right? And I like the correspondence idea that you mentioned as well. That's something that would be good to include. And this also means you can both discuss previous character relationships you've had so I can put them in the game.
Yeah, this is going to be the sort of thing where you end up with a list of people that you know and your relationship to them and things that you've done.
It's a chart or
yes,
a map.
It's a whole chart. This is one of those ones where, like, and do I have a good understanding of what happened in the world's history 20 years ago? Like,
this is also a game that at the table you probably want to have the corkboard with the string between different theories.
You need, like, little avatars of all the NPCs to be like, right, okay, King Polonius, like, what was his deal again?
So like a character map that you can interact with would be a useful tool for me to build for this game as well, right? Like a relationship map with like the lines between them. So that gives an idea for our game. The next thing I want to discuss is a couple examples of generalized rules that we should set. So I'm going to give my main rule first to start off this discussion, and it's the level of control the DM has. I've always played my games that the DM gets the final call, right? I am always open to discussion because I've made wrong calls before. But I do get to say, this is what's going to happen anyways at the end, right? As a general rule, I always allow the rule of cool once. So if you want to do something that I've never seen before, but it's really cool and not unrealistic, I'll allow it. But if it's broken, I will only allow it once. So you both get that one free call to be really cool.
That one, like, this is like, all in. If this doesn't work, we're screwed. I'm going to do it once.
Yeah. I've always allowed do it once. It's like the cast create water in someone's lungs example, right? Which is a horrible one, but it's
really bad. Like, rules as written, it works, but
I'll allow it once because I've never seen it. But, well, I have in one of my previous games, but I allowed it once because I never saw it before. And then I said, okay, we're not going to do that again, though, because that's not good.
Yes, you're a very spirit of the law, not law to the to the
spirit
letter
of the law.
Yeah.
It's definitely the style we're going for. As another standard for DM control, if I make a call and then later realize I didn't like the call, I'm not going to really go back and change it unless it's super necessary. But I will say, for future games, this is how the type of situation is going to be ruled, just in case I've messed it up. But as said, always open to discussion, but final say goes to the DM, and I'll try to limit discussion to a couple of minutes, just because the game flow is more important to me, right?
And I think with a narrative-heavy game like the one we're discussing, it's important that when you make a call that you don't go back to fix it, because we will get stuck on like, okay,
How
but
does that
you
change
made
everything?
that correction, and how does that change the chain of events?
Retconning is always dangerous.
Really hard.
So
yeah.
we'll avoid retconning, but I will tell you if I believe I made a decision wrong, and I'll tell you how I'll decide in that type of situation in the future.
I hope
Very
I
reasonable.
hope that the players would also feel comfortable doing that too, because sometimes I've made as a player, I've made the stance like, no, this spell is instantaneous. And it's like, no, it takes a minute to cast. Oh wait, but maybe the rule of cool was it happened, but then we both realized we were not necessarily interpreting it right.
Yeah,
there
but
was
it's
there was
still
one
fun.
mistake that I made where I took the grappler feat, which has a you need a minimum strength of 13, and I used the grappler feat in a fight, and then I went back when we did our when I took the next level and I was looking at feats and I noticed the fine print and I went, oh shoot, I shouldn't have been able to do that. And I was like, I messaged my DM and I go hey, I've made this mistake. Can I just I'm going to take a feat for my level and then can I go back and change this feat because I can't have it in the first place? And then we were like, yep. And I was like, okay. And the grappling thing that happened, and he was like, it's fine. It happened. It was just kind of a luck of the draw kind of day. You woke up feeling really strong.
Eat your Wheaties that day and you're
Yes.
good.
Yeah, I'll throw in one more rule, and I'm going to pass one to you, Vi, that I know you've been waiting for.
Cool.
So one other rule on characters is your character is not a fixed, solid thing, right? If you need to change classes or change subclasses, I'm open to that within reason, right? Like, for example, if you're playing a paladin and you go against your god and lose his favor and you want to switch into, a similar class, like maybe warlock or cleric under a different god, I'll allow it as long as there's a good roleplay reason, right? As long as you can justify it, I'm okay with changing up characters because I think that's more fun for the player in the long run.
You mean this instead of taking okay, I have Paladin 6 and I'm going to take Warlock 1 to reflect a narrative choice. You mean going back and then taking Warlock to 7?
Yeah, if you need to, right? So you're not going to lose progress. So I'm okay with you changing around your characters a bit. And I prefer that you give your character new styles rather than just killing off the characters so you get a new one. Right? I think it's more important to maintain characters and let them change over time and be dynamic than for them to disappear.
Cool.
Right?
The one rule that I was going to bring to the table
Which is one that I want to include, so I'm going to let you discuss it.
might not be super relevant for this game, but could.
Definitely
is
could.
to if you want to cast a spell that you don't have slots for, right? Maybe you're a 4th level caster and you don't have a 7th level spell, but you think it would be perfect, or you're in a pinch and you really want to try it. It's a luck roll to see if it works. And then if it does, it takes your 4th level spell slot, and then it's a 7th level spell, 3 levels of exhaustion to try to cast that 7th level spell. So it might work, maybe. And if it does, you have sort of that immediate, oh no, I'm feeling poor kind of.
That's cool. I'd never heard that
Detriment.
particular rule.
Yeah,
before.
I found that online at some point, and it stuck in my brain, and I've never been able to use it. So.
And remember, each level of exhaustion takes a full long rest to get rid of. So this is a emergency pool of energy. Admittedly, just because of how punishing exhaustion is in D&D, I'm okay avoiding the luck roll, just letting you do it. Because exhaustion is so cruel to players that if you're willing to take such a large hit to yourself, it's 1 level of exhaustion per spell slot. Level 2 takes 2 exhaustions, etc.
Actually, this could be really fun in a narrative political intrigue game, because the 1st level of exhaustion is your ability checks, which is also your charisma and etc. So you're gonna find a point where you did exert that influence in a magical way that you wanted to, but now until you get to sleep, you're at a permanent disadvantage.
And I think this is another thing about the session 0 and this rules discussion. Sometimes we think about it as, I think, the rules that are already in the game, but it can also be the time where both GM and player can say, I like this idea of a rule that I've not seen done in your games. I would give an example for Critical Role's death procedure.
Oh, yeah, I love
or
that.
revival,
Yeah.
where it's not just a simple cast the spell and it's done, but instead it turns into a great role-playing moment where those who are contributing to the success of it have to do some sort of role-playing or in-game a gesture.
Yeah, there's
to
some
make
kind
it
of
work.
like sacrifice that you make as an individual.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
To
And
bring
that's-
your friend back.
And that's not a rule as written. As written, the spell just happens and it works, but it adds more in depth to that moment. And especially if we're talking, again, this narratively heavy game, death should be relatively infrequent and it should be meaningful. And hopefully you can bring that meaning to the resurrection, with the exception that if there's only, for example, the two of us as players, it doesn't really work.
Yeah.
Because it would just be the other player.
Yeah.
One person. But if you have a group, Critical Role has at times 8 people, and so there's always extra connections between people
Yeah.
that allow that to not just be the same people doing it over and over again.
Yeah, that's a fun when you have a big group of people like that, because it often allows somebody who's a more quiet player to exert a lot of like narrative influence on one moment, right?
Yeah.
They don't have to make a lot of choices, but they can make one big choice and that will like impact something in the game.
Yeah. So I have now one type of rule I want to ask both of your opinions on. It's a rule that I've used, or not, maybe not rule, but standard that I've used in the past, but it's always good to ask how your players feel. Obviously, homebrewing in items and enemies is a standard for D&D. That's just how D&D works, or role-playing games in general, sorry. But how do you both feel about role-playing elements such as class features or feats or other more advanced things, maybe homebrewing an entire subclass? What's your opinion on that? Should we allow it? Should we not allow it? What limitations would you both be comfortable with?
Are you talking in terms of the GM doing it or the player doing it?
Either way, assuming that I as a GM have to approve it first, how do you feel about homebrew on the larger scale issues?
I like homebrew. I think I can easily say that without hesitation. I like when people bring things to games that aren't something I can find in a resource book. I like when you just sort of have an idea and you go like, oh, how would that work? I think that's awesome. I think it's also really relevant for this because a lot of items tend to be kind of combat, like, like spell power related. Like, oh, you get to do a plus whatever hit. Might not be super relevant here, but like a ring of charisma to give you like a +1 could be really useful.
I feel like I should take the opposite stance just
Yeah.
to maintain balance here. But it's not in general that I don't like homebrew. As a GM, though, I'm a little afraid of it because I have some very crafty players and they may not see the implications of what they're doing, whereas they may fully intend the implications to be the real side effect. So it can be something as simple as, well, this weapon allows me a third attack as a bonus action.
Yeah.
Sounds like a simple thing, but that might spiral out to, oh, they can use that all the time, and suddenly they're more powerful than the fighter, even though they're a wizard or whatever. And so I'm very cautious about that. As a GM, I do it all the time. Like it's pretty much a standard thing because you're building your world, and to my mind, I'm building the world that the characters are going to inhabit, not just a world where they're going to visit. But when a player comes to me and says, I want to do this, even if it's something like taking a class from a new book or from some other third-party book or something like that.
Yeah, or like one of the Unearthed Arcana stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and even those ones in the third-party books, it might work because in the context of the rest of the stuff they've introduced in that book, it makes sense. But suddenly now within this game, it's a game changer, both in terms of the effect that they have, but also in the world lore. So it can, sometimes it can be simple to say, well, everybody has flush toilets because they're magical.
Yes.
But is that something that is going to be too much if your character is a flush toilet manufacturer? I don't know that example necessarily, but most of the time those toilets are really just some sort of obliviating. They get rid of the stuff.
Yeah, it's so we don't have to think about it later.
Right,
Yeah.
but then you have a toilet and he just carries a toilet around, puts it on people's heads, and suddenly he's rules the world.
Yeah.
So I think there's some caution in there, but it's always to me a discussion. It's always a discussion about what happens, and I always feel, especially as a GM, but sometimes as a player, that there's always a later potential review of that discussion when you go, wait, this was not what we thought it was, or it implies too much. Maybe we're going to shape this a little bit differently. So yes for homebrew for me, but in a cautious way.
Okay, I like that.
I have a very specific example of this, actually. So I had players find a sort of lab of some ancient elven person. And the magic that they've kind of been messing with is like, touching different planes and that kind of influence. So the door to the lab is like you draw a door on a rock with a piece of chalk and it becomes a door and you can open it. And so I thought, okay, well, that's a cool spell and a little like fun puzzle. And then I was like, but you know what could be in here as an item for the players is pieces of chalk that have that spell in it so that you can just draw a door or draw like a circle. And I sort of went, okay, this sounds a lot like the portable hole that already exists. So I went and took the description from Portable Hole, threw it in, and then shared it with my players once they found the object. And they read it and sort of went, okay, so that's going to be this. We can't use it as a back door. And I read it again and went, oh, this fully isn't what I intended. Scratch all of that. Like, don't even worry about it. What this does is like 10 foot deep, 6 feet wide. It's a tunnel, right? That's the purpose of this chalk.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which I really like that because it's a limited use door. To anywhere, which I really like. So I'm going to talk about one more rule before we take a bit of a break. And this is a rule on metagaming. Now, I talked about my whole speech last episode. I'm not going to do it again. So as a general rule, any rule book besides a campaign book that I'm using is fair game, right? So knowing enemy stats, knowing abilities, like understanding like the spells and things enemies can use, that's all accessible to you if you're literate. That's the only rule. Your character must be literate to access it.
Very reasonable. Yeah.
I will modify things from those books. So they might not be accurate, but you can use them as much as you want.
And the in-fiction explanation of this is, of course, like, yeah, there's a lot of knowledge out there about creatures that exist in this world, but who knows how reliable that information is when it was recorded versus what's really out there.
Yeah, I think situationally there's also the element of if it's a small fishing town, which is one of my settings, they don't have access to a library.
Yes.
So it's rumors and it's stories, but not necessarily at all correct.
Yes.
And I reskin everything. Everything is not by the book.
Yeah, one of my DMs is like that too. We have never encountered a creature, I think, that looked like any of the things from the books.
I tend to take creatures from the books, but the more obscure versions of them. So I won't throw wolves, but I'll go get like a specific style of dire wolf from random campaign book 3 and use that. As a discussion on metagaming, though, as a push for the players, don't pause your decision making to go look up information to influence what the correct or incorrect decision is. Once you're in the game making a decision, check your notes. That's fine. Check your experiences. Don't go open a random rule book that your character in that moment might not have access to.
Okay, so if you're doing a research, like, okay, there's a revenant ghost that's doing things, and I'm going to go look up in a library what that is, I can go crack open my monster manual.
Yes.
But if I'm in the fight with it, I'm not referring to the book.
I'll give one exception for that. You can maybe do like a history roll to recall it, and I'll give you the information.
Right.
But I don't want to pause the game for you to go look up rules, because that slows the game down really bad and makes it less enjoyable for players.
I understand what you're saying.
But there's rules to remember, and I'll be pretty friendly with them and give you the information you need.
That would have been my only exception, is that, in the situation they can make a roll to potentially remember something, but then the information controlled by the GM, who presumably already knows it.
Yeah, who probably has it on their screen, like, in front of them, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that kind of covers all the examples I have for defining a game theme and for defining game rules and systems. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick pause for ourselves to go drink some water and handle all of that. And when we come back, we're going to be discussing the topics of lines and veils and other additives that we should bring up in Session Zeros that might not have fit this discussion. So, see you in a second. And we're back. So, we're going into our third topic for today's episode after having discussed game theme and game rules. Now it's what you're not okay with in your games, lines and veils. So as a bit of a trigger warning for those listening, for those who have already heard our message at the beginning, this is where we're talking about the things we don't want to see in a game, and it could be a little more intense. So if any of the topics you heard earlier don't really fit with you, thank you for listening. It's okay to exit here, but if you want to continue, here we go. So, as an important piece of our Session Zero, I need to tell you what I'm not okay DMing, and you need to tell me what you're not okay playing.
I'm just going to jump in here and just say lines and veils as a definition.
Yeah.
A line being a hard line. This is where I draw my line in the sand. please, we don't cross this. I will be very uncomfortable, or maybe have to exit the room if we do have to cross this line. A veil being something like, I'm uncomfortable with it, but it probably is going to be okay, maybe. Let's approach it with care and caution and maybe a fade to black approach.
Yeah. So I will start this off by giving an example of one line and one veil for me as a DM. So as a bit of a hard rule, I am not going to roleplay romance with players in any way. Your character can have a romantic partner and you can talk about them. The players can roleplay romance with each other if they feel like it. But I'm not comfortable role-playing romance with someone, especially if I have to do it for multiple characters for multiple players. So I'm not going to do that in
Are
my
you
games.
comfortable doing it in the third person?
I can do it a little bit in the third person, but I would prefer for you as a player just to say, here's what happens, and I'm just going to accept it as long as I've just given you the thumbs up to that romantic relationship. You have full control. So,
and the interesting thing here is this is one of those examples of something that would be different depending on the GM. I'm fully comfortable doing romantic scenes with players, and even depending on what I have to play, it can be any gender, sex, race, being, age, anything like that. And it doesn't really bother me with certain boundaries. But it's interesting that is one of those ones that is very different depending on the GM, and it's good to mention that.
yeah. So for me, you can include it, but I'm not acting it.
Right.
That's the line. And I'll give a veil as well for us to discuss. I actually don't think this is going to be a problem because we've discussed it already, but I am not going to do a game with murder hobos is the word that I've written. Like I'm not comfortable doing the game where the players are constantly ignoring the plot, ignoring the people, and being violent, being standoffish, avoiding all story just for fight and loot. I know that's not a problem, but to give the example, if you lean in that direction, I'll stop to have a discussion about it, and I can let you go in that way, but I'm going to always try to pull it back and add in appropriate punishments for it and discuss it, tell you that I'm not okay with the direction it's going, and give appropriate warnings.
Cool. So this is going to be the sort of thing where, like, you will put plot hooks in our way, and it'll be the sort of thing where we should buy into a plot hook and not just sort of go, I'm going to go do this other thing.
Yeah, and you can ignore some plot hooks, but definitely going down the I'm going to kill random NPC for no reason, or I'm going to destroy your plot hooks, especially. I'm not really okay with that unless we have a discussion beforehand and figure out like a good reason or what you would prefer to have happen. So it's open for discussion.
And in terms of lines and veils, the difference there would be a line would be there's not going to be any violent action. A veil is there may be violent action up to a point, and then we do it off screen.
Yeah.
So it's not eliminating it, but there's a certain threshold that will be reached.
There's a point where I'd rather have the discussion than to keep role playing destroying
Right.
everything. But
Right.
there's a degree of you can cause chaos. I'm okay with it. Just there will be a point where I might have a discussion.
Gotcha.
So those are my two big things I've given. I'm going to pass over either one of you that you feel like jumping in. What are you not okay with in the game, and what would you like there to be discussion or warnings about?
I have a line. The example that I'll put here, so it's sort of unreality, but it's when you've bought into a genre and the way the world works, and then something else happens that is outside of that. For example, I'm watching an episode of Criminal Minds right now, which is like, it's a procedural, right? It happens in the real world. There is nothing supernatural. It is all explained by people's actions in the real world, except that in the beginning parts of this episode, the people who are doing, this is also a show about like serial killing and stuff like that. There is the people who are doing the killing of their loved ones are hallucinating a very scary, like sort of dark shadow monster, which doesn't fit in the world of Criminal Minds and has totally freaked me out. They explain it later being like, yeah, this is sort of like a psychological conditioning drug thing that this person, this discrete human being is doing. But like the introduction to that is really scary for me. So that's my hard line, is that like unreality. If it happens in the world, it should make sense. And if it doesn't, I'm going to be somewhere else.
I think that I'll hit one of the big ones, and that is sexual violence. I think that That is not something which I would either feel comfortable or are interested in exploring in a role-playing game. It's funny because the two components, sex and violence, I don't have as much of a problem, but certainly put together, that introduces a very big problem. And I don't think that's a very common one that people want to include, but at the same time, there are some that want to explore some of the darker themes. You know, if you're playing a vampire role-playing game, you're going to start cresting that hill a little bit more often and a little bit more closely than if you're playing, Wanderhome, for example. If you stuck that something in Wanderhome, you'd be like, this is not.
That too would be something that doesn't fit in the world for me, right? It's super, like, I'm trying to say that, like, there are things that are thematic that kind of work, like there is an element of like grimdark to Criminal Minds, but there is never an element of supernatural, and then suddenly there is. Yeah, for sure.
And depending on how you want to present your world, they can often be very dark and gritty, and you can again kind of come up to the edge of that. But I don't want to cross into that. It should never be something that I'm facing directly anyway.
Got it. So, hard rules. Make sure we lead into everything. Everything fits into the world's theme, which is a more nebulous idea, but one that I can follow. And no sexual violence. A very easy to follow. That topic's gone.
Yeah.
Now, in a proper session 0, I might tell you to watch this specific episode so that you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
Like sort of specific examples of like where I'm not comfortable.
Yeah. So we also now have to bring up the veils. So I'll pass this back to you two. What are 2 veils, one each, that you'd want discussion over in the game, or that you would want trigger warnings or etc.?
Body horror is really freaky to me. Characters growing an extra eye. Like, if it's happening to my PC, I need to be able to at least dissociate from it, and there needs to be a way to walk it back. Right? We have to be able to cast Greater Restoration to get my hand back, to remove that third eye, to do something like that. There has to be a way to be like, I'm not okay with that. Can we talk about it? That's a veil for me.
It's interesting. I feel like I'm bringing all the heavy topics today, but one of the veils that I would suggest for me is racism. Because it's something that, is an element sometimes of these worlds. The different species will have different opinions about each other. And I think there's a certain level of that at which I'm interested and comfortable with. Sometimes it's more on a cultural level. But when it starts to get into something that would be touching on real world racism, I'm not comfortable with that. And I would rather see that eliminated, or at least only attributed to the bad people, if you will.
Yeah.
Because I kind of like the world to be a little bit more of an enjoyable place. And again, these are things that are topics at your table, and sometimes games really are built around that, and they can be really good games that are hard and emotional, but they're really cathartic at the same time. But one of the easy ones that come up in D&D all the time is the elf versus dwarf kind of thing.
Yeah.
And where does that fit, and or does it fit, and how do you represent that? And do you move it to the cultural level? And a veil would be move it to the cultural level. Maybe it'd be a little more understandable. But there are the drow that exist in D&D, which have long been a questionable
This comes
choice.
to the discussion of like, okay, are monsters fundamentally evil, right? If you find a creature in the monster manual, okay, do you always kill it when you come across it? Why do you make that assumption?
Yep.
I have a DM who is like super into bugs, really loves them, thinks they're like super cool little guys, right? I'm not super huge on bugs, but I now understand where their understanding of like, hey, we've encountered a mimic, don't kill it, kind of comes from.
Yep.
Like, we're always going to give something a chance.
And shades of evil, too. You know, it's like, is the bad guy reformable? I want to hire him.
Yeah.
And I've had games where that's the attitude, is like, that's the way they wanted to play it. And the real dark evil could exist, but we want the chance to redeem anything.
Yes.
It's the party which adopts every animal they ever come across
Yes.
and suddenly have a posse.
It's the party that assumes that everything is fundamentally good until sort of proven otherwise, or you go beyond a threshold of like, okay, well, you are now irredeemable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me bring this into the context of our game that we've defined. So talking about the body horror thing first. Our game is going to be very roleplay heavy. So it's going to be very rare that the topic of body horror could come up in the first place. But when I'm describing scenes, maybe of a character having died or been attacked, I should be presenting trigger warnings beforehand and tell you, in this scene, the person died in a way that would have lost this limb or had this horror. And I don't think adding limbs or adding body parts will ever come up, so I can avoid the really bad area of it. but trigger warnings for dismemberment and for types of death are going to be important. And on the racism one, that one is very important for a game that's very heavy in role play. If I present hatred of a group of people, it has to be because that group of people did an action that led to a level of distrust between the groups of people.
Yeah, there might be a historical thing of like, yeah, that clan killed all of the people that I know, 20 years ago or 100 years ago, or my grandma told me about it, and that's why this character believes that.
Yeah. So I can't just have people hate each other randomly in the game. And I usually actually make a line on racism in most of my games. There will not be fantasy racism in my games. So,
but you end up with questions like bugbears and goblins.
Yeah.
And how sentient are they, and where do they fit in that spectrum? Are they truly evil, or are they orcs? As another example that comes up all the time. If you talk about Lord of the Rings, they're definitely seen as a created mechanistic evil.
Yes, for sure. Yeah,
but not necessarily in D&D.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, where does an NPC become a monster, and where does a monster become an NPC? Because those have different categories in players' minds.
Yeah, and as a game heavy in roleplay that we've defined, a mystery game especially, I'm okay taking a lot of the questionable sentient ones and upgrading them into they're sentient, fully conscious. If they're evil, it's because of action or because of teaching and not because they're born evil. And I prefer that because it gives me more options for characters in my games. I like role-playing the kobolds.
I think you've talked about something in the mechanics of games. You had a really good name for it, where like a group of characters having a defined term or a defined set of traits is actually sort of poor to the game's development.
Oh, it was like characteristic determinism or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? Is like there can be some degree of this group of people are trained more in this area and might be bigger built because of experience, but giving a deterministic requirement for a group of people is going to hurt the narrative. Right? It tells you, we're encountering a dwarf. They like drinking, they like underground, they're strong and short and stout and all these things, and it hurts my narrative to have to force that, right? That I can only do that, and breaking it is more fun.
So it could be really fun in this world if we have a good conversation about like, okay, where are people? What does this history look like now that we've decided that like monsters can be people too? What do their cultures look like? This actually opens up a bigger door to us for world building and history.
Yeah, so all the questionable sentience, interact with them, learn their languages. That's more fun for me. It gives me more options for a grand adventure and roleplay. And it means that I'm just not going to include fantasy racism. I personally don't like it. It's always been a line for me, though I didn't bring it up in my personal lines. But if it wasn't, the discussion would really be racism is clearly evil, and I'm not going to force you to be allies with someone who's just a racist.
Yeah, on the same token, I think anything that we believe to be true as humans is also probably a line here. Like, homophobia shouldn't exist in this world, and things of that nature. That kind of like discrimination probably just doesn't have a place here.
And, it's funny because sometimes these feel like inherent things, but I feel like they need to be discussed. That's one of the big things we're learning in the last few decades, is that we really do need to make these things explicit. And sometimes it's about, like I said, if you're doing a theme of a campaign, which is about racism, then clearly that's not a line anymore.
Yeah.
That's not a veil. That's something that's inherent to the story, and everybody should know that.
Yeah, this was what I was thinking about when you were talking about your lines. I was like, those are also lines for me, but I was thinking in my space, in my little bubble here, not in the broader sense of things.
And in the range of stories we tell at the table, sometimes those things come up. You talked about the CSI.
Yeah.
Well, they've definitely had cases where it's about a sexual assault, and that's core to the story, and they may go into some detail about that. It's like, well, I don't really want to do that in my game,
for sure.
But it might make sense if you're doing it in a more clinical way, and you kind of talk about that. But talking about it means you don't end up with that awkward scene in the middle of a session going, this is the whole mystery plotted about this thing, and you don't like that.
I don't like that. I don't have anything for this week.
Right,
then.
yeah.
Yeah, so overall, racism and discrimination, evil, is going to be one of our basically lines. You can fight racism, but it's also not going to be a big part of our discussion. I'm not building a culture around racism for you to go experience.
Now, more common lines are things like phobias. The idea that, you cannot stand spiders, so there shall be no spiders anywhere threatening me at any time. That's one that's pretty common.
We have a mutual friend who has some traumatic experience involving like gun violence. So like it's always going to be a line, right? We just don't talk about that.
Yep.
Exactly. And admittedly, that brings us to the end of our Session 0 discussion. We've discussed the general game theme. We've discussed what rules we want and don't want. We've discussed what we are okay having in the game, what we're not okay having in the game, and what we're kind of okay having in the game. So before we close out, we have a few seconds left. Any other notes anyone wants to add before we go?
I just wanted to ask Mark what kind of character you would play.
It's funny because I've played a sort of investigative character, and when I know that I don't have to be combat, I like playing older, wiser characters who've been through stuff.
Yeah.
So they have a lot of experience, but they're not necessarily the one that's going to be able to wield the sword in a really effective way.
Okay.
So sometimes it's about that, or I'll play diminutive characters who don't have that physical strength. I think in something like this, it would be a detective. I'd want to play a detective. I want to play a dwarven flatfoot kind of thing.
Ooh, okay, that's really fun. I was going to go the other way and go, I want to be someone who is like sort of relatively new to the idea of politics, but is kind of naturally good at it. So like really high charisma, like even when you fumble, it looks like you're doing that on purpose kind of thing. I was thinking like a very classic, like high elven kind of druid-ish sorcerer kind of person, you know, to do the like, I'm going to do a little party trick and show everybody how perfect I am and actually be doing something else behind the scenes.
I like the idea of the perky elf versus the grumpy dwarf kind of combination. It's a classic and it works for well.
I think that would be a fun game to play.
And that concludes everything. So I'm going to go prepare the game, and that brings us to the end of the episode. So I'm Gaia.
I'm Vi.
I'm Mark.
And we'll see you next time.
And if you want to hear more from us or listen to past episodes, tune in live every Thursday at 9 p.m. Atlantic on CHSR 97.9 FM in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And if you're online, you can listen live at chsrfm.ca or on your favorite podcast platform. We'll see you next time.